He has the clean. He has it if he can hold it. He does. Alexeyev of Russia has just lifted 501.5 pounds. The first man ever in competition to lift over 500 pounds.
In 1970, Vasily Alexeyev became the first man to lift 500 pounds overhead in competition. This began a series of 80 world records where we saw Vasily increase each world record by 1.5 to half kilo increments each year, and we saw a series of 8 world and European championships in a row. He also held 2 Olympic gold medals. We moved to the 1988 Summer Olympics. We saw the Soviet Union, or the USSR, win 6 out of 10 possible gold medals and 2 silver. In 1992, in Barcelona, we saw the unified team, which is essentially the USSR nation again, win 5 out of 10 possible gold medals with 4 silver medals. 1996, Russia made its first appearance as an individual nation, and we saw 2 gold medals with 1 silver. 2000 Sydney Olympics came along. We saw Russia win only 1 gold medal out of a possible 15 with 2 bronze medals. In 2004, this was the last gold medal we would see from a Russian weightlifting male team to date. And in 2008, we saw Russia's last gold medal at any Olympics from a female lifter. This was won by Oksana Silvenko in the 69 kilo category. Finally, the last Olympics we've seen Russian weightlifting attend was the 2012 Summer Olympics, where Russia won 1 silver medal and 1 bronze medal. Now, obviously, a lot of these medals have been taken away, most notably the 2012. You can see a declining results from Russian weightlifting in the last couple of decades over the last Summer Olympics. 2015 essentially was the beginning of the end for the Russian Weightlifting Federation. Notably, accumulation of events. We saw the ARD documentary exposing a lot of the discrepancies among Russian anti-doping. We also saw the documentary, some of the events from Gregory Rodchenkov. We saw him exposing or kind of whistleblowing a lot of the events that occurred with the disappearing positives, the use of the Duchess cocktail. All very interesting events from an academic point of view and a scandalous point of view, but absolutely horrendous for the Russian Weightlifting Federation. Now, there is obviously dozens of European championships, world championships in between, where Russia did very, very well with some certain lifters. However, in the last number of years, the Russian Weightlifting Federation has obviously declined. 2015 would have been the last major event we would have seen from a gold medal from a Russian male weightlifter, Artem Oklov. Now, following these obviously detrimental events to the Russian Weightlifting Federation's ability to produce medalists, we've seen a new Russian team kind of step forward from the shadows. A lot more humble, a lot less dominant, and we're seeing a different kind of balance coming from the Russian Weightlifting Federation. So the most recent competition at the time of recording of this, most major event from the Russian Federation, we're seeing a very, very dominant female team in terms of comparison to the male team. We saw the Russian females winning a possible running 24 medals, the highest medal count. And per points was the dominant team at the European Championships, whereas the men's team won a paltry 9 medals, only 1 gold. Now, these are including individual medals as well and not title places, and came 4th in the points rankings of the team rankings at the end of the event. Some of the things that we feel from our point of view, obviously this is all speculation, we don't have any insider knowledge in the Russian Federation, but we're just going to make some observations, some of the things that we think they'll need to overcome, some of the things that seem to be going right for them, but also some of the issues that they'll face, and will Russia ever really be a dominant weightlifting team again in the future? So the first thing the Russian Weightlifting Federation will have to overcome, and are obviously in the process of overcoming, is a thing here at Sikhistan any of our athletes have no concept of, and I've be honest, I've written it down in our notes, but I just can't fathom it, is lifting with less drugs. The sentence, I understand the words I'm saying it with the sentence, but I just don't know what it means. But Sikhistan lifters won't have to figure that out, but apparently the Russian lifters will have to figure that out. So essentially, it's kind of obvious, but it's they're currently in a situation where they are the black sheep. They're in a situation where they're the black sheep, and people internationally, the media, through the anti-doping agencies have pinpointed them as a nation who are the evil ones. They were a great scapegoat for the last couple of years. Now, we've talked about this wholesale, but obviously there's new people joining every time. We have a long podcast on the morality of doping where we kind of talked about from both sides of the lifters, or from athletes who dope. Just to be clear, just for new people listening, or new people who have stumbled on the video, we're not judging Russia for doping. There's plenty of other nations that the International Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, could pinpoint and attack ferociously and catch them if they really wanted to. But Russia have made themselves that. They've ended up as that kind of scapegoat. They are Ivan Drago from Rocky, and they're in a situation where they are not able to currently dope as much as they would have in the past. Now, again, this is just an observational point from us. It's not a morality doping point. Probably, there's a lot to go into there. But essentially, what they'll have to figure out how to do is train their lifters without drugs, essentially, or using a lot less drugs. So that's kind of the main thing they'll have to figure out. So what do you think that look like, Fitz?
I think it's going to look very different. So when you look at the Russian situation, and like state-sponsored doping happens in a lot of countries, doping happens in probably every country in the world. But what you had in Russia is you had this glorious leadership who would allow for huge amounts of support, and then basically copious amounts of corruption to basically cover up any amounts of drug tests, and even push drug testing in the opposite direction of bringing state-sponsored labs, WADA certified labs in to help their athletes pass more drug tests. So when you look at what those training systems look like, when you have all of the support, when you have all of the kind of green flags basically to keep going, is you develop a system in absentia of kind of natural athletes. You develop a coaching setup, you develop a support structure which is entirely focused around this fully government backed, fully lab supported, and kind of fully insulated from any sort of repercussions. When that is taken away, that system is going to look very, very different. So if you talk about lifting with less drugs, because realistically lifting without drugs just won't happen, or in a lot of cases it just won't happen, it's going to probably look like people training on their own or training in smaller groups. Maybe the illicit activities will probably take place with athletes out on their own, or they might take place in the vast majority of cases will probably take place in these kind of transitionary periods when athletes are going from juniors to being seniors, or to try and make onto a team, or to try and break through the next plateau. That's currently where you see, in highly tested nations, that's where you see a lot of adverse analytical findings. That's where you see a lot of people getting popped. It's when they're going from being in school to being in university to being a professional athlete. These kind of high pressure areas are where people generally get popped. And this is probably what you're going to see in the Russian system. Is you won't see this kind of large systematic doping protocols, but you'll see the kind of normal places people would get caught for doping.
So if we look at the individual system, so we're going to look at the Russian lifters, especially the males, will have to lift with a lot less volume, so total volume, sets and reps in their training. They'll have to lift with less intensity more frequently, so they won't be able to do as heavy weights more frequently or more often. They'll have to, and this kind of particular point relies or impacts the current lifters who would have been through the initial regime where doping was fundamental to their training. They would have been in a scenario where doping and weightlifting would have been the only way they would have experienced lifting. So now these current batch of lifters, the kind of ones in their 20s, are going to have to figure out how to peak for competitions with less drugs. So prior, we would have seen places, and other nations still do this, of course, but the Russian lifters individually will have to learn how to peak for competition without peaking their drugs, similarly to what other nations would do, or they would have done in the past, where they would have known how much drugs they would have been taking. They would have known that would have been their maximum performance when they were peaking with their drugs. So they would have then been able to know that the performance would have been a great state, so they're psychologically and obviously more importantly physically would have been in a fantastic state to peak for these competitions and peaking for whatever training max they would have been aiming at. So then another aspect, which will probably be one of the harder ones for them to adjust to, because initially, obviously the coaches are very skilled. So that's something that kind of bothers me sometimes with programming, is something that just because a coach dopes in their team, that they then are a terrible coach and they know nothing about weightlifting. Now, it's certainly a possibility, and there's obviously coaches, just as many coaches who dope their lifters who are terrible coaches, and we've seen those in person, as well as lifters who dope their lifters, or as well as coaches who dope their lifters and know astronomical amount of weightlifting. So the fundamental kind of technique that they will have to do will be slightly different. The current technique won't rely as much on drugs to accommodate for that kind of high volume training. They'll have to learn how to balance that volume and intensity with its effect on their technique. So as you're very fatigued, your technique suffers from fatigue, is your ability to not main positions as much. You will have things like less upper body strength. Obviously, weightlifters can only spend so much time training their upper body. Taking performance enhancing drugs will give you a certain kick in upper body strength without having to put too much effort into it, and their certain technique will rely a lot on that. So a lot of posterior back and legs will benefit hugely from what we see as a huge boost from drugs without having to put too much effort directly towards that. Obviously, their squats will have to be given more attention and more nuance to maintain certain number of lifts. And then finally as well, we do see with some of the Russian lifters, and the males in particular, they're a lot slower. So their actual movement and bar speed are a lot slower, even at weights that are within their capability, as probably as what they would have done as a natural lifter anyway. So we see them moving a lot slower with some of those weights. And so this is something they will have to figure out. Honestly though, for this crop of lifters, this current lifters who are there, I don't think we're going to see them return to form. A lot of those greats, a lot of them are done forever. We've seen people like Abdi Alkadov, his career is finished. Adam Malagov, most notably as well, 2 grade 85 kilo lifters. Their career is over now. In reality, they should be in their prime right now. They should be, if things were as they were, they would be still, doing incredibly well. Their career's finished. For the other ones who are still lifting, who managed to escape the Inquisition, they are in a position where they're going to have to figure out how to do it a little bit differently, and it's going to be pretty difficult.
I think when you look at like the changes for the athletes, so for that crop who are left on here, the changes are almost all going to be negative. I can't see too many athletes being absolutely delighted, even though there may be. I think for most of them, a culture like that won't just leave immediately. So there'll be a certain expectation for coaching staff. There'll be a certain expectation of the amount of medals they should be winning. And they'll have an often like that kind of psychological predisposition that Owen talked about of, this is what I expect when I start training. Like they've probably used substances for over a decade in certain cases. They will expect a certain level of progress, a certain level of increases in 1RMs. And when that doesn't start to come, that's going to be the really, really difficult part. So that lacking of support structure will be negative for almost all the athletes. The last thing I would say is, in terms of just general health outcomes for these guys and girls, you're probably going to see more athletes being harmed in Russia in the next 10 years than you would have seen in the previous 10 years. So granted, there were some horrific things done with performance enhancing drugs over a long time, since like the 40s. But what you had in that Russian system in particular was a very, very kind of noted tracking system for all athletes. They all had different kind of experiences with it. I know in one or two of the books that you were talking about, the experiences were negative, but what you had is basically qualified healthcare professionals looking after athletes. You're probably not going to have that now in a lot of cases. So the overall kind of net effect of that, I'd say, for the lifters will be negative.
So the next thing they'll have to do, and it's obvious this is what is going to happen if they wish to return to the forefront of weightlifting, unless the entire weightlifting culture changes, and that is they'll need to find out other ways of passing drug tests. Now, this might be return to normality, so this will be give it a couple of years, wait for all this blow over, go to the Winchester, have a pint, and wait for all this.
Keep smiling and waving.
Keep smiling and waving. So wait till all this blows over, essentially. Wait till the news, as the news cycles move on, the next few Olympics roll around. Now, for the individual athletes, this is terrible. This is their career over. For Russian weightlifting as a whole, just a little bit of patience, couple of years. What it could look like is they could just simply apply the same methods as before and just rinse and repeat. We know WADA is complicit in a lot of corruption. We know they're negligent. We know they just don't really care. We know, but
come on.
We know that they will essentially return to normalcy at certain stages, what I see probably happening. So essentially they just need to wait that game out, and that would obviously will involve research into new ways of passing drug tests, new ways of corrupting officials, new types of drugs, different kind of things like that, waiting for a new Gregory Rodchenkov to come along and develop intuitive ways of doping. So I see that as probably one of the things they will have to do, and they probably, of course, absolutely are endeavouring to do right now across all their sports, just as every other nation basically is, or most nations are, where they're just trying to figure out how to pass drug tests again, or pass drug tests while leaving that lifter in the most optimal state of performance for them.
Yeah, like it's a moot point, but there's lifters in the most highly regulated countries in the world. Like there's American weightlifters on performance enhancing drugs right now, and they get past tests. So if you think that Russian lifters will never ever take performance enhancing drugs again, just because it mightn't be state sponsored, almost all of your favorite weightlifters are probably dabbling in it right now. They're probably doing it today. They're probably doing it as you're watching this YouTube video. So if you think they can get past tests in the UK, mainland Europe, and the US, I'm sure there's going to be Russian lifters in the future well able to get past drug tests too.
So the next thing that will be of issue for the Russian Federation is that they will need to deal with potentially less financial support from the Russian government if weightlifting, for example, is removed from the Olympics. I could imagine a scenario where if weightlifting is removed from the Olympics, this would possibly eliminate all funding for weightlifting, as the Russian government would see no reason to continue to finance Russian weightlifting and put the huge amount of resources into it that they do. What would be the point essentially of financing this if they're not going to win Olympic medals, obviously. So that is something that obviously will be a huge concern for them. Obviously, as they are winning less medals now, especially in the men's division, although we see the women's division is doing a lot better, which we'll get to in a second, but the men's division is doing far worse than it ever has, even with the decline in the last few decades. So they are in a position where they need to reassure officials, and obviously reassure them in ways that they can pass drug tests, for example. That could be any number of things, where they need to reassure them that they will get medals again in the future, that they just need to sit around in the Winchester for a few weeks or a few months or a few years while this situation changes, while the dynamics change, and they can get back to a situation where they can secure medals again for the country of Russia. Great country. One of the most notable things we've seen, and I think this year in particular, we've seen that the female side, the women's division, is doing very, very well in comparison to how the men's division is faring. So we've seen that as I mentioned earlier in the video, the women's division won a lot of medals. They won the most number of medals in terms of points. They came out the best at the 2020 Europeans, and they are very, very likely doing this and without the use of performance enhancing drugs, or an incredible minimal amount of performance enhancing drugs. But I would be willing to put money on that they're doing it with basically zero performance enhancing drugs.
I'd say at the moment it's very likely that the Russian female lifters are using the same amount, if not less, than any other of the nations you may previously have thought to be clean. But there are other things you probably should mention about female Russian weightlifters who are currently lifting. So obviously pharmacology affects males very, very differently from how it affects females, and those kind of latent effects that everyone would have heard of from taking performance enhancing drugs do last a small bit longer and are slightly more potent in female populations than they seem to be in male populations. So this is by no means us saying like, oh, those Russian females are doing great because they were enhanced years ago, but it is something you have to be cognizant of the lasting effects of previous performance enhancing drug use is very different in female populations as it is from males.
So I think the notable thing about this is a lot of these current female weightlifters that have made the appearance at the Europeans are a lot younger. They are lifting similar weights to nations again that, if it's saying are considered to be clean, or they're lifting actually less than a lot of them or some of them. They're in a position, I think, probably because this newer, younger batch of female lifters would have been, for example, in their teens when this current doping situation would have arisen, where they would have been, okay, we're not going to be able to dope our lifters, so they would have had to pivot. The absolute weights that females lift are obviously less, but typically women, natural women who don't take performance enhancing drugs, can handle a lot more volume and a lot more intensity a lot more frequently. So we would have seen this time frame compress to where they would have been. So we would have seen this when they were trying to get to the top level compressed faster than the men's division, as typically women's lifting in general would appear to be less doped, and it always seems to be a case with weightlifting. So they would have had this advantage compared to the men's, and they would have been kind of progressing faster because they can handle more training in the same period of time that men would have been able to handle. And so the absolute weights the men would have to be lifting will take a lot longer. So I think the crop of young teenage Russian lifters right now will probably be the ones we'll be seeing who will, I'm confident, I think we've seen some good lifters at the junior worlds. Now, obviously, Russia, as we mentioned, are of course still doping, but I think the scenarios will be a little bit different. They'll be coming up in a different environment, so they'll be able to adapt a little bit easier to whatever that situation might actually be than the current crop of lifters who would have relied on the old system.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll say on this is that people who are writing off that Russian system, and there are a lot of them out there who say that Russian system is only great because it was state-sponsored doping behind it, you don't really have a concept of just how prolific that kind of entire scientific sports training system is in Russia. Mm-hmm. It is billions and billions of euros or dollars pumped into it every year. It's a country with a huge amount of resources, and particularly in the case of weightlifting, it's a country who has a long history of weightlifting, a long history of scientific methods and very, very well documented methods in weightlifting. So I think it would be hugely remiss to write off the Russian weightlifting system and purely say it's only because of X or Y or Z. That Russian system is definitely going to flourish again at some point, whether that be in absentia of state-sponsored doping or whether it just in a slightly different form.
Yep. So just to pivot a little bit, thanks for watching. We hope you like this style of video. I think what we might do next is the rise of Italian weightlifting. I think would be a good definitely. One to do. We might actually try to talk to someone on the Italian team if we can at all get someone, which would be cool, I think. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment for the algorithm, a like, all that good stuff. Next up in our masterclass is strength and conditioning for combat sports. So we'll be announcing the first date for that soon, and we'll be announcing the lineup and the sign up for that. So combat for strength conditioning for combat sports is our next masterclass. So stay tuned for that if you are in that sphere, because you could be watching this video and you could be